Hi everyone, welcome to week 1 of Principles of Macroeconomics. For this week, here's the week 1 overview. Here's the required resources for this week. The main resource is going to be your textbook as we're reading chapters 1 through 3. When we look at this week, we're going to be focused on the role of economics. Economics is looking at how individuals and households interact with each other in the economy. And we have two different types of economics. We have microeconomics, deals with how individuals make decisions, and we have macroeconomics, which is looking at how the economy as a whole makes decisions and influences individuals and businesses. While microeconomics is looking at how individuals and businesses influence the economy as a whole, macro is looking at how the economy as a whole can influence individuals and businesses. Scarcity is a concept that we all are dealing with. When we look at scarcity, it's one of the fundamental problems in economics. Scarcity is determined by the level of prices in our economy. If you look at an example between oil and water, you notice that water is much cheaper relative to oil, so oil will be relatively more scarce. Another term we're going to look at is that of opportunity cost. Opportunity cost is looking at what do you have to give up to get. And every decision in economics involves giving up something to get something. Let's look at the production possibility frontier and apply the concept of scarcity and opportunity cost to it. When you look at this graph, the first concept you want to look at is how do we obtain all of our resources? Anywhere on this line we can obtain. And when we look at these resources, you want to produce anywhere on that line. Anywhere outside of the curve is unattainable. Anything inside the curve is attainable. When we look at the production possibility frontier, we're looking at how we can obtain our resources using the fixed production of goods and services. The term opportunity cost is looking at what we have to give up to get. So when we look at point A, and let's say we want to go to point P. So we have to give up producing 4 tons of soybeans to produce 1 ton of leaves or leaves. So there's always a trade-off between our goods and services where we want to produce it. When we look at the concept of unemployment, unemployment is focused where we're producing our various goods and services. And when we look at inside the production possibility frontier, you'll notice that there is unemployment that exists. Unemployment exists inside the production possibility frontier because we're not using all of our resources efficiently. And then we can also illustrate economic growth. Economic growth can be illustrated when we look at anything that's being produced outside of our area of production. So economic growth is very important. Whenever there's an increase in the amount of resources that are being produced, you can notice that economic growth is being achieved in our economy. When we look at this graph right here, here's the original production possibility frontier, and here is the new production possibility frontier. When you look at this new graph, you notice that we're producing more. And given that we're producing more, you'll notice that economic growth has been achieved. The way economic growth is being achieved is through technological advancement. Technology allows us to be able to produce more goods and services, and that's a very important key component to our economy. If you look at this graph right here, you notice there's a technological advancement in soybeans because we're able to produce more. However, with levees, you'll notice there is no technological advancement. Now, we look at chapter 2, we're looking at the factors of production. The factors of production are looking at our limited resources, which are land, labor, capital, and entrepreneurship. The most important factor of production is entrepreneurship. Entrepreneurship is key because they're the ones that take the risk and gather the other factors of production. And the other factors of production are finding the best land to start a business, getting the best people, and getting the best machines, which is capital. The three basic economic questions that we have to evaluate in our economy are: what goods and services should be produced, how will they be produced, and for whom will they be produced? You'll notice that what goods and services are going to be produced are looking at the goods and services in terms of what people want, whereas how they'll be produced is looking at the production, and the production mechanism focus on how should companies produce the goods and services that consumers want. The other example we look at is looking at for whom. For whom is evaluating who should the goods and services be produced for. They should be produced for who's ever able to afford them, which is what you're looking at with the last question. There's three types of economies or economic systems. The first type of economic system is the traditional economy, which looks at answering the basic economics questions, and it's dealing with how systems are maintained. Now, a command or planned economy is a little bit different. A command economy is looking at where the government makes decisions in our economy on what goods and services should be produced. And a market economy is an example of an economy where there's buyers and sellers making decisions with no government intervention. And when we look at a market economy, you'll notice that they're very focused on how to evaluate the role of prices. And governments do not get involved with a market economy. When we look at the two-sector circular flow model, so when we look at the circular flow model, we want to see how households and firms interact with one another in this model. And we look at this graph right here, you'll notice that this is the households right here, and here are the firms. Households are going to supply goods and services. Households are going to supply their services in the resource market, and the resources that the households own are the land, labor, capital, and entrepreneurship, whereas firms are going to supply them factor payments. And these are the payments for the factors of production. Now, firms are going to supply goods and services to households, whereas households are going to supply the money to buy those goods and services. So when we look at this graph, we're going to be looking at how firms and how households interact with each other. And they interact with each other in two different markets. And the way they interact with each other are through the product and resource market. Now, when we look at the role of the government, you'll notice that the role of the government is very important in our economy. And the role of the government has to deal with many different challenges. Why the government has to deal with many different challenges is through different things that we look at. And one of the ways the government has to deal with many different challenges is through positive externalities. Positive externalities are benefits to a third party, whereas negative externalities are classified as costs to a third party. You notice that businesses and governments and individuals have to deal with both positive and negative externalities. An example of a negative externality would be smoking. An example of a positive externality would be picking up trash. All of those are benefits to a third party. And when we look at the benefits to a third party, you'll notice that to create these benefits, the government has to get involved to increase production. Whereas a negative externality, the government will have to get involved to decrease production. Now, when we look at Chapter 3 is going to focus on the role of demand and supply. Demand is looking at buyers in the market, and the key that you want to focus here in this chapter is the law of demand. The law of demand is an inverse relationship between the price and quantity demanded. Make sure to key in on quantity demanded. Quantity demanded is the amount purchased, which is different than a change in demand. A change in demand is a shift of the demand curve either to the right or to the left. Here is an example of we start right here at D0. An increase in demand goes to D1. A decrease in demand goes to D2. You'll notice that these functions or these changes in demand or shifts of the curve is called a change in demand or either an increase in demand or a decrease in demand. Now supply is dealing with sellers, and the law of supply is a direct relationship between the price of a good and the amount being supplied in the market. And we look at it, the quantity supplied is looked at how much is being supplied in the market. And this is a direct relationship. Again, you want to focus on a change in supply versus a change in quantity supply. A change in supply is brought about by factors that will change the supply curve and increase it or decrease it. Whereas a change in quantity supplied is looking at a change in the price of a good or service. If we look at it, here is the supply curve. An increase in the supply will go to S1. Decrease in supply will go to S2. Now, here's an example of a market that's in equilibrium right here, where supply and demand intersect. When this graph is when they're equal, this is where both buyers and sellers agree upon the price. You'll notice that at different prices that are established, like at $4, you notice that there are 8 million pounds available on the market, and you notice that there are only 4 million people that want it. Now we're at 2 million. You notice that 8 million people want it. However, there's only 4 million available. That's where markets are not in equilibrium. And we will have to make adjustments where supply and demand will have to intersect. Where prices will have to make the decision on what happens in the market. So these are some of the concepts that you're going to be focused on this week. If you need additional resources or help, please let me know. Please also visit the instructor guidance part as well. But I look forward to your effort.